Today we're talking about the wines of the rest of North America, meaning the United States and Canada. We'll also take a quick peek at Mexico. I'm experimenting with some of the wines in this lecture, as this will be the first time I taste a couple of them. What I love about these regions and wines is that they are new pioneers and new wine regions of the future. Most of their wineries are started out by families, maybe just like yours and mine, but they have a dream to create something new, something they wish to share with us. A lot of blood, sweat, and tears go into creating a winery, along with hard work, perseverance, and teamwork. I mean, there is nothing more truly American. You're going to need the following wines for today. A New York wine, either a Finger Lakes or a Long Island Chardonnay. A Texas wine. A Virginia wine. Here, get a fruit wine as well. Here we have the Red Ass Rhubarb from South Dakota. A wine from Idaho. And an ice wine from Canada. Here we have the Inniskillin. You might think as a master of wine, I've tasted every producer and been to every region in the world, but that would take several lifetimes over. So this is an exciting lecture for me, as there are wines here that I've never tasted before. This will be a discovery for us together. As I said in our last lecture, you may have a hard time locating these wines. So if you can't find them, don't worry about it. If you live here in North America, try to find a wine from your state or province. Let's start with the US. Now, believe it or not, there are wineries in every state in the United States. After the repeal of Prohibition in 1933, each state was allowed to create its own set of laws regarding the sale and distribution of alcohol. Even today, it's a very confusing system. In most countries in Europe, the producer is allowed to sell directly to restaurants and retail stores, as well as directly to consumers. In the US, however, the only direct selling is in wineries themselves. Otherwise, wineries must sell their wines to a wholesaler, who then sells to a restaurant, who then sells to the consumer. It's called the three-tier system. In the 1980s and 1990s, these wholesalers consolidated, so the big players got even bigger. Many of the wineries outside California, Washington, Oregon, however, are too small to get into the portfolios of some of these larger wholesalers. And even if they do, the wholesaler portfolios are so huge that these tiny little wineries don't get any attention. This, plus the small quantities they produce, is part of the reason why you don't see many of these wines on a national basis. Now, the top three states in terms of the number of wineries, after California, Washington, and Oregon, are New York, Virginia, and Texas. And we'll spend most of our time on them. I'm going to start with the next biggest wine state in the US, and my home state, New York. Long Island was an early wine producer using indigenous American vines because of the problem with phylloxera, which I mentioned in lecture 18. These days, Vitis vinifera is the predominant grape species, starting with plantings by the Hargrave family in 1973. And in the last 25 years, Long Island wines have really taken off. They've gone from 100 acres to over 3,000. Long Island obviously has a huge maritime influence, comparable to what you see in Bordeaux. The growing season is 3 weeks longer than in any other area in New York, so they can do well with some thicker skinned varieties that ripen later, such as Merlot and Cabernet Franc. You see wineries on the North Fork of Long Island and some on the South Fork near the Hamptons, such as this one called Channing Daughters. And this is their Chardonnay. So let's taste it. Let's take a look at the color. This is a yellow gold, very pretty, and it's a little bit deeper as you would expect because it's a Chardonnay and it's got some oak in it, so it's a little bit deeper in color. Fairly neutral in its aromatics, but that's Chardonnay, it's not surprising. But the aromas that I do get, it's definitely upfront in its fruit, so you get that apple flavor, and so that tells us it's the New World, but I also get a strong sense of butter, of cream, a little biscuity tones, as well as some toasted vanilla. So we can tell this has been seen some treatment with oak. Now let's taste it. It's very, very ripe, and it's rich. It's fairly full-bodied, but it's got a creamy texture, and so that tells me it's had some batonnage done to it, so some lees stirring, but it's got a really long finish. And the oak that it has is very well integrated. And you got some layers of complexity as you had seen on the nose. It's a beautiful wine. This wine shows you the ambition of Long Island wines. Here's a Chardonnay that has used wild yeast to ferment, which can create even more layers of flavors and more rounded mouthfeel. It's also got a traditional white Burgundy batonnage, or lees stirring I was mentioning before, and that's for its texture. And because it's fermented and matured in oak, it's got the complexities of vanilla and toast on top of those apple flavors. Now, Larry Perrine of Channing Daughters was the first person I spoke to who produced wine. I went to the winery to talk to him about getting into wine because I really had this romantic vision of creating wine and being in the industry. I pictured traveling around the world, drinking great wines, dining in amazing restaurants, and getting paid to think about wine 24/7. I mean, how great is that? Well, Larry took one look at me in my stiff corporate suit and briefcase and said, "What are you doing out here?" And at that moment, it hit me like a ton of bricks. Wine growing is farming. Now, if you're thinking about starting your own winery, consider this. Your assets to sales ratio is about 10 to 1. That's a lot of capital expenditure to outlay, and the largest cost is the land. How expensive is it? Well, last time I heard, land in Napa was being sold for anywhere between $120,000 to $500,000 per acre. And in Champaign, land might sell for as much as $1 million per acre. And this is just for empty land. This doesn't include the cost of the vines, the cost to plant, the trellising systems, and maintaining them. Understand, too, that you can't pick grapes for wine until your vines are more than 3 years old. Actually, you don't even really get good quality generally until the vines are around their 9th year. This is just to grow the grapes. And there are many people out there who just grow grapes to sell to wineries. Oh, and what about the winery? You have to purchase tanks and all those beautiful French oak barrels. Well, they run about $900 a pop each year. Then what about the cost of bottles, labeling, marketing? I mean, people have to know about your winery somehow. Wineries outlay so much cash that the few that actually survive typically don't break even until their 10th year. There's a saying in the wine industry that if you want to make a small fortune in the wine industry, you start with a large one. I hope I didn't discourage you if you had dreams of starting your own winery. However, this should give you a much larger perspective and a respect for those wineries across the United States that have persevered and succeeded. The second main wine region in New York is near the Finger Lakes. One of the first vineyards here was started by Dr. Konstantin Frank, a Russian viticulturalist who immigrated to the US in 1951. Everyone told him it was too cold in New York to plant Vitis vinifera vines, but he said, "I'm from Russia. It's even colder there." The Finger Lakes are narrow, deep lakes that were formed during the Ice Age. They have steep slopes that have great sun exposure, and just like in Germany, the moderating effect and reflecting influence of the lakes help the berries to ripen. With this environment, what kind of wines might you expect? Well, if you guessed Rieslings and Gewürztraminers and late harvest botrytized sweet Rieslings, you're right. Hermann J. Wiemer is another winery that makes quality Rieslings. And his family had influence in the German wine industry and saw potential in the Finger Lakes region. This region also creates some successful wines using French-American hybrids. Now, a hybrid is a marriage of two grape species, whereas a crossing is a marriage of two grape varieties. The American species protect against winter freeze and phylloxera. The French species has the flavors that the winemakers want. Séville Blanc and Vidal are successful examples of white grape hybrids that are shown everywhere in New York and except Long Island. You should especially look for Séville Blanc from the Hudson River Valley region. The French Huguenots planted grapes along the Hudson River in the 1600s, and this region also claims to have the oldest active winery in America. It's called Brotherhood and was started in 1839. Lastly, grapes are grown in the region around Lake Erie, near the Canadian border. After the Civil War, this area was known as the Grape Belt because of the prohibitionist pressure. More and more indigenous grapevines like Concord were planted for grape juice rather than for wine. However, Vitis vinifera is increasingly common. Let's travel down the East Coast to the wineries of Virginia, which follows New York in number of wineries. Grapes have been planted here since the settlement of Jamestown in 1607, although back then they made wine with indigenous grapes. Thomas Jefferson himself tried but failed to get vinifera vines to grow at his estate in Virginia. However, he still encouraged others to try to make America a successful wine-growing nation. He even minimized wine taxation to help encourage development. Today, Virginia has 6 AVAs, or American Viticultural Areas, and one of them is Jefferson's estate of Monticello. Now, Jefferson was well known for the outstanding quality European wines he served at the White House. Later on, Lincoln's wife, First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln, introduced American wines at White House dinners. So there was a period of time when First Lady Jackie Kennedy occasionally served French wines. Serving only American wines for official functions is the policy at the White House today. This makes sense. Not only do we have great wines in the United States, but would you expect to dine with the President of France or the Prime Minister of Italy in their home country and be served a California wine? In Virginia, the growing season is warm and humid, so cold resistance is not needed much here. And the vinifera vines outweigh hybrids as much as 4-to-1 in some areas. You see Chardonnay and Bordeaux varieties, as well as very tannic varieties such as Touriga Nacional, which you remember from lectures 8 and 16, Tannat, and Petit Verdot. You can also find indigenous American red grape varieties called Norton, planted in Virginia, and some people argue that this is the only indigenous American grape variety making premium quality wine. Here we have one from Chrysalis Vineyards. Now let's take a look at it. I haven't tasted this one before. It's about medium ruby color. See if we can see our fingers through it. It's slightly opaque, but not too opaque. You can still see your fingers. About medium aromatic intensity, but the aromas that I get actually remind me a little bit of a cross between Merlot and Pinot Noir. I get some of the dark blackberry fruit, but I also get some cherry fruit as well. It's very pretty, very fruity. But it's also very upfront fruit, so we know that it's from the New World. Let's taste it. It's very fruity on the palate. It's got some balanced acidity, and it's got some soft, supple tannins. It's not gripping. It's actually really quite nice. A lot of American indigenous grape varieties are known for a flavor called foxiness, and this doesn't have that at all. It reminds me a lot of Vitis vinifera vines. Well, now how fun is that? There are 3 predominant areas for wine. Northwest of Washington, D.C., in the central part of the state around Charlottesville, and in the Shenandoah Valley near the Blue Ridge Mountains. Here I have a red from Linden Vineyards, a few hours west of D.C. Linden Vineyards has been used by the White House. This is the first time I'm trying one of their wines, so I'm excited to taste it. I've got their single vineyard designation here, the Hardscrabble Red, which is made from classic Bordeaux varieties. So let's take a look at it. Well, it's definitely made from thick-skinned varieties because it's deep. I can barely see my fingers through it, and it's opaque. And actually, this wine is unfined and unfiltered, which is another reason why you won't be able to see your fingers through it. It's moderately aromatic, but that's typical for Bordeaux blend. And definitely get the black currant of the Cabernet Sauvignon. But it's got some black cherry notes in there as well, and I get some hints of rose petals, and also a little bit of an herbal, savory quality to it as well. And I also get some toast, so that lets us know that it's seen some oak. Let's taste it. That's full-bodied. That's full-bodied, but it's got some nice bright acidity, and it got a nice chocolatey texture, and some tannic grip, again, coming from the Cabernet Sauvignon. This is another wine that shows great ambition, and I'm sure that Jefferson is smiling down from the heavens, just quite proud, and probably wishing he had a glass himself. Now let's go west to Texas, the fifth largest wine-producing state in the United States. Winemaking in Texas predates California by about 100 years. Just like in California, the missionaries played a significant role in introducing wines here. The earliest recorded wines in Texas were produced in the 1650s by Spanish missionaries coming from Mexico. Franciscan priests planted vines near modern-day El Paso. The grape they planted here was called the mission grape, a black grape variety and a vinifera one at that, likely from Spain and brought over by the conquistadors. The wines weren't considered high quality, however, they were primarily used for sacramental purposes. Nowadays, the wines aren't only good, they're also experimental. Where else would you find jalapeno wine? By the way, the indigenous American varieties that were grafted with vinifera vines to resist phylloxera in Europe came from Texas. So we have them to thank for saving the European wines in the industry in the late 1800s. Prohibition practically destroyed the Texan wine industry, and today 25% of the counties there have dry laws. It wasn't until the 1970s that the industry really had a kick start. One of the best-known regions for quality here is the Texas High Plains, where the soil is calcareous with red sandy loam that adds finesse to the wines. Because of the region's high elevation, the nights are cool, which retains fresh acidity in the grapes. The University of Texas, which partners with a Bordeaux company named Cordier, is the largest producer in the state. These two regions, the High Plains AVA and the Escondido Valley AVA in the Trans-Pico region, produce the majority of the wine in the state. You can also find good wines and have a great wine tasting tour in the Southeast region around Austin, San Antonio, and Houston. Well, if you think of Texas, you think of barbecue, and you might ask yourself, what kind of wine will pair best with barbecue? It's not a simple answer, unfortunately. It's going to depend on a lot of different factors. Is it made with a spice rub? Is it with a tomato sauce? Is it spicy? Is it sweet? I'm going to talk a little bit about barbecue in the last lecture, but let me give you a warning here. Not all barbecue sauces are fit for pairing with wines because if they're too sweet, they'll make your dry wine taste very sour, and too much spice can shut down your palate so that all you get is alcohol. Also, be careful on food and wine pairings you see posted on the web. Make sure that you are getting information from a reputable site. Here we have two wines from Texas, Becker Vineyards Syrah and a Cabernet Sauvignon from Llano Estacado Winery. Let's taste one. Here we'll taste the Becker Syrah. Take a look at the color. Definitely tell it's made from a thick-skinned grape variety, and it's opaque. Moderate in its aromatics. And you definitely get some Syrah fruit, but this is more of a Syrah style than a Shiraz style because you're getting some herbal characteristics, some savory characteristics, a little meaty quality, but you get that black pepper that you associate with Syrah and that rich red raspberry fruit. It's fairly full-bodied. I'd say medium plus, I would say. And it's got some nice balanced acidity, a little bit higher than I would have expected. Maybe that's because of the limestone, perhaps. And it's got a nice chocolatey texture, and it's got a fairly long finish. This is a nice quality wine. This is a new wine for me, but if you taste it along with me, you can see why I'm encouraging you to explore American wines from all over the country. And you should look for wines from places that you don't think of immediately as being wine country. For example, you may have seen a sparkling wine called Cruet. I've seen this wine in a few restaurants in my travels across the United States, and I was surprised to learn that it's a sparkling wine from New Mexico. So you too may be surprised at how good wines are from unlikely spots around the country. I should also mention that everything up until this point has been about wine made from grapes. A broad definition of wine is an alcoholic drink made by fermenting the juice of fruits or berries. However, it doesn't include things that you have to hydrolyze from a starch, such as beer or rice that makes sake. For some reason, mead, made from honey, has its own name and is considered a different category. There are many producers in the US as well as abroad that produce wine from fruit other than grapes. Any fruit can be made into wine from its own fermentable sugar. Even if there isn't enough fermentable sugar, producers can add sucrose or table sugar. Yeast will naturally convert the sucrose into the glucose and fructose during fermentation that's needed. Now, I've tasted all kinds of fruit wines, from strawberry wine to elderberry wine to pineapple wine from Hawaii. You even see wines blended between grapes and other types of fruit. They're generally made sweet and great entry-level wines. Wines can even be made from a vegetable such as rhubarb. Here we have one called red ass rhubarb from the prairie berry in western South Dakota, not too far actually from Mount Rushmore. I've never tasted it before, so I'm excited to try it. First, look at the beautiful color. It's very pale. It's like a rosé color. It's really quite stunning. And it's quite aromatic as well. And it smells of raspberries and of rhubarb. And that's actually because it's made with raspberries and rhubarb. And it smells, if you've ever had a strawberry rhubarb pie, it smells exactly like that, including the smell of that sweetness. Oh, it's definitely sweet. But it's got a high level of acidity there that is cleaning all of that cloying sweetness. It's quite delicious, actually. Prairie Berry also makes wines from pumpkins, which I've never tasted either. I mean, are these first growth Bordeaux? No. But they're fun and in your own backyard and part of someone's American dream. When I first started drinking wine, I couldn't get enough of a wine called Spring Splendor from Pindar Vineyards on Long Island. It's an off-dry blush that's fermented with Merlot as well as cranberries. I loved its delicate sweet flavor with beautiful flavors of cranberries, and at $9.99 a bottle, I thought it was even better. Pindar is one of the largest wineries on Long Island, and some of their grapes come from California. Remember when we talked about négociants in Burgundy? It's the same kind of concept. A producer or winery buys grapes from different vineyards that come from all over the US. And as long as it's made in the US, it can say table wine, product of the United States on the label. There are also some wineries that are virtual wineries. What do I mean by that? It means that they purchase their grapes from vineyards and then they rent space at a winery, a separate winery, or custom crush facility to produce it. Some of these virtual wineries don't advertise that they rent rather than own their facilities, but they're still wineries, they're real wineries, and you may be drinking some of the brands without even knowing it. Now let's move across the country and check out the terroir of Idaho, especially the Snake River Valley region, where most of their wines, which is where most of their wines come from. The wine is from Sainte Chapelle, which was Idaho's first winery, and it was about 2/3 of the state's vineyards. These vineyards sit at about 2,500 feet, which makes them a bit higher in elevation than the western vineyards in Oregon and some of the vineyards in Washington. Their day and nighttime temperatures also differ greatly, which really elevates the acidity in these wines. This is why varieties such as Riesling, Gewürztraminer, Chenin Blanc, and Chardonnay do well here. They also have Merlot, Syrah, and Cab planted. So let's taste the Riesling that we have here from Idaho. It's pale in color, as we would expect from Riesling. And it's quite aromatic, as we would expect from an aromatic grape variety such as Riesling. And you get lemon, you get lime, a hint of stone fruit, but it's more citrusy. On the nose, I might say it smells, I haven't tasted it yet, but it almost smells like an Austrian Riesling. It's got a delicate sweetness to it, but because it's Riesling, it's got that high level of acidity that's cleaning the palate. And it's quite delicate in body, again, what you would expect from Riesling. So it's showing its true Riesling characteristics in the terroir of Idaho. Now let's pop out of America for a few minutes and look at Mexico and Canada. You don't see too many Mexican wines because their per capita consumption is about 1 glass per year. So it's not commercially very viable for them. Nevertheless, it's one of the largest areas in Latin America for growing and producing wines. Their first wines date back to 1521, influenced by the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors. By 1524, new Spanish settlements had been ordered by Cortés himself to plant 1,000 vines for every 100 natives. Unfortunately, the industry took a downturn when, in 1699, Spain's King Felipe II prohibited wine production in the new Spanish colonies to protect Spain's own wine industry. Only sacramental wine production was allowed after this. About 90% of all quality wine production in Mexico comes from vineyards in the northern end of Baja California. The maritime influence of the Pacific Ocean is similar to what you see in California, with a climate reminiscent of the Mediterranean. The most successful wines made here are full-bodied reds, especially Petit Syrah and Zinfandel. Now let's go north to Canada. There were almost no vinifera grape varieties here until 1988, when Canada dropped its trade barriers against imports. The government actually paid people to replant their vineyards with vinifera, as they had mostly been planted with Vitis labrusca hybrids. As a result, Canada's wines have taken off since the 1990s, and some say areas like the Okanagan Valley, about 100 miles east of Vancouver, are like Napa, where Napa was about 30 years ago. That area's first winery actually only produced apple wine. Each province has its own monopolistic provincial liquor control board that controls production, sale, and distribution of wine. To encourage the creation of high-quality wines, Ontario and British Columbia created the Vintners Quality Alliance, or VQA. Wines must pass the test and a chemical analysis to get the VQA seal of approval. The grapes are also limited to vinifera and some American varieties and hybrids. Vitis labrusca does not qualify for this. There are two main regions that are the most important in putting Canada on the international wine scene for quality: the Niagara Peninsula in the province of Ontario, where 80% of Canada's vines are located, and the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia, which I've already mentioned. Besides the moderating effect from Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, the Niagara Peninsula also has the Niagara Escarpment, which helps shield the wine region from Arctic continental winds. The climate is similar to that of Burgundy, and they create Burgundian varietals, Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. But they can produce very elegant Rieslings as well. Notice the focus on varieties that like cool climates and can yield high acidity. However, they are probably the best known for their ice wines. Here I have the Inniskillen Vidal. Karl Kaiser of Inniskillen was born and raised in Austria and studied wine at a Cistercian monastery vineyard. He then moved with his wife and his in-laws to Ontario, Canada. In 1975, and with Donald Zeraldo, they created Inniskillen, the first winery in Ontario since Prohibition. They were real pioneers in quality winemaking in Ontario, and they have placed the province on the international map for quality wines. Vidal is a French hybrid. It has a thick skin, which makes it suitable for sweet, late-harvest wines with no botrytis. Botrytis likes thin-skinned grapes, remember. And these grapes cannot be picked unless the temperature goes below 8 degrees Celsius or 18 degrees Fahrenheit. But let's taste it. This is their Vidal Gold, and the color is indeed yellow gold, a deep yellow gold. It's fairly aromatic, but not as aromatic as let's say, Riesling. Let's smell it. This smells of honey and of nectarines and peach nectar. It's a beautiful aroma. You don't get the citrusy note that you get from Riesling. Let's taste it. Wow, this is lusciously sweet. It tastes of honey. But unlike botrytized wines, I don't get any of that kind of dried marzipan-y kind of fruit to it. So you can tell it doesn't have any botrytic notes. But some people say that you get the flavors of fresh snow. I mean, I don't particularly get it, but Some people say they do. You may get it yourself. But even as I'm talking, I've talked for several seconds here, the flavor is just lasting and lasting. This is a very high quality wine, especially for a hybrid. Now in British Columbia, the Okanagan Valley is one of the world's most northern wine regions. It's at about the same latitude as Champagne and the Rheingau in Germany. It's surrounded by the Cascade Mountains to the west and the Monashee Mountains in the east. Despite being so far up north, the region is known for being very sunny, very warm, and dry. The Cascades help protect the Okanagan Valley from storms and moisture. Technically, the area is a desert. There's also a chain of lakes here that moderates the temperature. They cool the vineyards in the summer and warm them in the winter. The soils are also a sandy clay loam and on slopes, which means they drain well and the grapes ripen very well. There are over 80 wineries in the Okanagan, and they're most successful with aromatics varieties such as Sauvignon Blanc and Alsatian varieties such as Riesling, Gewürztraminer, and Pinot Gris. Are you starting to connect the dots between these regions? I knew it would be easier for you to understand once you had gone through the other lectures. Next up, we travel to South America. You'll need the following wines: a Sauvignon Blanc, a Sancerre from France, a Carmenere from Chile, a Cabernet Sauvignon, again from Chile, and then we go off to Argentina with a Torrontés, as well as a Malbec from Argentina. These wines are incredible New World values and great secret weapons of many sommeliers and restaurants today. You should check out what all the talk is about. I leave you with an abridged quote from the famous American writer Ernest Hemingway. Wine offers a greater range for enjoyment and appreciation than possibly any other purely sensory thing. No truer words have been said. Until next time, cheers.